So on to now panel 3 of the first day. This panel will deal with themes in Africa. I should introduce myself as well. I'm Philip Gooding. I'm a postdoctoral fellow. I'm one of Archman's colleagues at the Indian Ocean World Centre. So to begin, we are going to have a presentation by Dr. Rafaël Thiebaut, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the Musée de quai Branly at Jacques Chirac in France. The presentation is entitled "The Terrible Ouragan of 1760 in the Southwest Indian Ocean." So when you are ready, Rafaël, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much, Philip. Let me just share my screen. It's great. Okay, well, thank you very much. So today I will talk about the terrible ouragan of 1760 in the Southwest Indian Ocean, which hit Port Louis, Île-de-France. So in this paper, I will emphasize the consequences of this natural disaster on the tactical situation of the French in the Indian Ocean in the midst of the 7 Years' War. So to start, Okay, so to start with the personal diary of the French governor, Antoine-Marie Desforges-Boucher, where we find the following passage on 28th of January 1760. Donc, il ne manquait plus à nos malheurs l'événement cruel qui vient d'y mettre le comble. So the only thing that was missing to our misfortunes was the most cruel event that has just made everything worse. And he's referring to this cyclone, which he called the terrible ouragan with violence extraordinaire. So first I will explain the history of the French Mascarenes, followed by the importance and the frequency of the cyclones in the area, before really concentrating on this 1760 cyclone. So on this map of the Southwest Indian Ocean, we see the Mascarene Islands, really to the south, next to the big island of Madagascar. So the Mascarene Islands are composed of 2 islands, Île-de-France, nowadays Mauritius, with its capital Port Louis. And the second island is Île Bourbon, which is called La Réunion now. So they interacted a lot in commerce, mostly with Madagascar, but also with the French outpost on the Indian subcontinent, which is all the way to the north. So it took about 2 months of sailing to go from Port Louis to Pondichéry. So the Mascarenes were developed mostly, were administrated by the French Compagnie des Indes, which had the monopoly on French trade to the East Indies. And while the islands were mostly used as refreshment stations, there was also a cash crop plantation economy that was developed from the beginning of the 18th century. So this led to the introduction of thousands of slaves, mostly from Madagascar, creating a slave society quite similar to that existed in the Caribbean. So by 1760, coffee, sugar, and indigo were cultivated alongside rice, corn, and manioc by some 3,000 slaves. And the Compagnie had no further interest in really developing the Mascarenes, who had to find the right balance between their role as refreshment station for Compagnie ships and the tropical agriculture, because by this time only 10% of the Île-de-France was cultivated, because development was hindered by the presence of, for example, a great number of locusts, of rats, and also natural disasters like droughts and cyclones that happened often. At the same time, Port Louis was developed as a naval base. This was the need for a safe harbor. That was one of the reasons to develop this Port Louis, because it was the only safe harbor of the French in the Indian Ocean during the 18th century. And it became the main naval base of the French squadrons during their wars with the English. But it had also some inconveniences. For example, it was situated, as I already said, quite far from the heartland of the Compagnie, so far from Pondichéry. It took 2 months of sailing, while the English were quite close by in Bombay. And the other inconvenience was the absence of sufficient food. So the Mascarenes had always difficulties to feed, especially the ever-increasing slave population. So, as I said, to find the right balance between food agriculture and tropical agriculture, and especially with the arrival of dozens of warships with soldiers and sailors, it was difficult to feed all these persons. So to the cyclones. So cyclones are frequent visitors in the Southwest Indian Ocean during the austral summer between December until April. And as early as 1615, 3 Dutch ships were wrecked at Mauritius, killing Governor General Peter Bott. And here we see a map with the path of different cyclones during the 1920s. Unfortunately, we don't have those types of maps for the 18th century. And nowadays there are roughly 2 cyclones every year that pass near the Mascarenes, and a landfall is made every 5 years. So the documentation from the 18th century is quite scanty. But we know that at least 1 cyclone is recorded every year, and we see that they are mostly happening during the austral summer, which also caused the mauvaise saison, when, of course, maritime trade was limited because of the adversing monsoon, as well as the presence of cyclones. And we see that most of the cyclones that I found during the 18th century happened between December and March, but also some outside of this austral summer. And we have also some exceptional cases, for example, in 1734, where there are 5 cyclones recorded in 1 year. Mostly there's only 1 important one every year. And we have, for the 1770s, we have quite some good information, thanks to the French botanist Serret, who has given all the passages of cyclones during this decade. And we see that every year there's at least 1 cyclone, and more often there are even 2, or in exceptional cases 3, as in 1771. So we see that it's really important natural phenomena that happen there, which disrupt maritime trade. And for example, all company ships have to be in Port Louis during the mauvaise saison, because if they stay in other harbors, they might be wrecked during the passage of a cyclone. So among the scourges of that haunt the Mascarene Islands, cyclones are considered the worst, because they not only attack the food sources, but they destroy everything in their path. As this testimony of a French resident in Ile-de-France in the 1740s reveal, that they destroy entire harvests, smash trees, and it often takes multiple years to recover and repair the damages, of course. And this person will also witness the obstacle that cyclones represent in the imperial ambitions of the French in the Indian Ocean. So in 1744, the War of the Austrian Succession started, with the French and the English being opposed in different parts of the world. And in March 1746, with limited resources, the governor Mahe de Bourdonnais managed to arm a small squadron to attack the English in India. Upon leaving Port Louis, the ships went to the east coast of Madagascar to obtain sufficient food before going to Pondichéry. They thought that the mauvaise saison already evolved. We are at the end of March, at the beginning of April. But on the 6th of April, their ships were hit by a cyclone, damaging most of them. And this delayed their mission for 2 months while repairing in Anton-Gilles Bay in Madagascar. But despite this event, the Bourdonnais managed to attack and take Madras a few months later. Unfortunately, things would be different in 1760. So the War of the Austrian Succession ended in a stalemate, and the French exchanged Madras for Louisbourg in Canada, and peace was only short-lived. And from 1756, a new war erupted, the 7 Years' War, which opposed again the French and the English in different theater, so in Europe, the Americas, and the Indian Ocean. So for the French, the Comte d'Aché was sent with 9 warships to the Indian Ocean to defend Pondichéry and attack the English. And Port-Louis served once again as a rear base. But the timing of the arrival of this squadron could not have been worse, because the situation in 1757 in the Mascarenes was really dire. The islands were faced with a terrible smallpox epidemic, and food shortages were already alarming. For example, Governor Magon wrote that the difficult situation in which I find myself and the pressing need that I have to draw help from all quarters in order to secure the life of my men, and for whom I have to find subsistence, has galvanized me. So on multiple occasions, Magon informed the company directors that he urgently needed all kinds of provision and military supplies from Europe in order to avoid dying of hunger. And company ships and naval squadrons that regularly called at Port-Louis drew heavily on the available local stocks that proved of vital importance. So Magon expressed his fear that he would be unable to feed the 7,000 soldiers and sailors whose arrival was anticipated. But still, the next years there was some successes thanks to the help from Madagascar and the Dutch Cape Colony. The Mascarene authorities were able to keep their heads above the water. So they kept the naval squadron well supplied, and Daché managed to fight off the English and help Pondichéry through 2 naval battles of Gondelour and Porto Novo. But these victories were short-lived, because Daché returned to Port-Louis during the 4 months of the mauvaise saison to refresh and to repair, being only able to operate in front of Pondichéry during 4 months out of 12. So this was the situation when the terrible ouragan struck. It was of an extraordinary force and lasted multiple days, something that was never seen. So one of the marine officers wrote que l'on avait rien vu de semblable, so they've never seen something like that. And plusieurs personnes très anciennes dans le pays ont assuré que depuis qu'ils y étaient, ils n'avaient vu pareille chose à cet ouragan. So even the elderly of Mauritius have never seen something comparable to this cyclone. And Governor Magon wrote that it was even more violent than the cyclone of 1751, which hit Bourbon and which destroyed the entire harvest. So the direct consequences were that all ships in Port-Louis, which was considered a safe harbor, so were sank or were wrecked. So no less than 11 warships are beached and 6 are irremediably lost. 1/3 of the houses of Port-Louis are destroyed and the rest is damaged, and at least 150 are dead, and all harvests are completely destroyed. So the absolute priority of the Mascarene authorities was to obtain food. Madagascar is usually a very important food source, both in rice and cattle. But the unrest, the Betsimisaraka civil war on the east coast already reduced this part, and the cyclone only made things worse. Indeed, the hurricane, which was felt in Madagascar, destroyed the crops, so that instead of 1.2 million ounces of rice, I have only to rely on 250 to 300,000 ounces, and more which will come so late that if I have not in time multiplied the expedition to procure us food, the colony would succumb under the horror of the most cruel famine. So it was thus decided to go search for other possible food sources, mostly at Dutch Cape, but also further away to Batavia, and even an expedition was sent to Buenos Aires to find food. So for the squadron of Daché, it took months before the ships were refloated and rearmed. But instead of being used to assist Pondichéry, they were sent to obtain food in different regions, because it was impossible to be able to sustain the entire population. So they were only used locally to defend the French Mascarenes and to go on these expeditions. So the long-term consequences well, we have of course, the fall of Pondichéry. Pondichéry was besieged in September 1759, and the city fell in January 1761. And the absence of naval support from the squadron of Daché during this crucial year of 1760 made French resistance futile, and the consequences were huge because the entire city was destroyed by the English before being returned to the French after the war. And this episode ended the French ambitions in the Indian Peninsula for good. And of course, the cyclone of 1760 played an important part in this crucial turn of events. So this was really, on the imperial part, a very important event, maybe less important, but still locally important consequences was the presence of shipwrecks in the port of Port-Louis. So some ships remained in place where the terrible ouragan has left them because it proved impossible to refloat. And they were often, so the ships were often, these carcasses were often hindering other ships in finding good anchor grounds in Port-Louis. This is why in the 1790s, a marine officer wrote that the ships wrecked in the 1760 hurricane form reefs which pose very great risk for the ships and maintain the worms which are destructive to our vessels. These carcasses must be cleared. So also locally and for the maritime trade, the cyclone in 1760 had its consequences for the French Mascarenes Islands. So to conclude, the violence of the 1760 cyclone was unprecedented and came at the worst possible moment during the height of the 7 Years' War. To the loss of life, the failed harvest and the material damage, the fate of the French presence in India should be added. So 3 times the squadron of Daché was instrumental in protecting and supplying Pondichéry. But with the cyclone of 1760, this mission has become impossible, and even worse, the entire food situation worsened and could only be resolved through the use of warships which were sent out on expeditions to obtain food in order to feed the population of the Mascarenes Islands. So this is all. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Thiebaut. Look forward to asking some questions shortly, but before we do that, let's move on with the other presentations in this panel. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Matthew Hannaford, who is a lecturer in geography at the University of Lincoln in the UK, and his presentation is entitled Drought and the Crisis of the Early 19th Century in Southeast Africa. Dr. Hannaford, when you're ready.
Thank you.
Bet.
Right, great.
Thank you.
Lovely, right, thank you very much for the introduction. So as the title suggests, I'm going to talk about the drought in the early 19th century and also the late 18th century and its consequences in Southeast Africa. So I'm particularly going to focus on Mozambique. I've also done some work across the same time period in KwaZulu-Natal in present-day Southern Africa and in South Africa, but that's still being written up for publication. So just a brief outline of the presentation. I'm going to give an introduction to the sort of early colonial period in Mozambique. And then I'm going to move on to talk about the crisis itself. So what actually constituted that crisis? Obviously, crisis is a word that's bandied about a lot, but what were the aspects of this particular episode? The main body of the presentation is going to actually re-examine the climatic context of the crisis and the droughts that occurred at that time in a much longer run context. So going right back to the mid 16th century and question to what extent these events were exceptional and to look at that in a sort of systematic context of from documentary records, but also from paleoclimate records as well, and compare the two. And then finally, I'm going to look at, re-examine some of Professor Malin Newitt's work on the Great Mozambique Drought, which is a term he coined for the long drought period in the late 1820s, and examine perhaps why that was so consequential in certainly the history of Portuguese settlement on the Zambezi, maybe more so than previous drought episodes. So just a brief introduction. Here you see a map of the sort of greater Mozambique area. You can see in the sort of hatched area the extent of Portuguese settlement at its high point. Although it's worth noting that the numbers of Portuguese in comparison to Africans were always very, very small indeed. The high point of that expansion in Mozambique was in the 17th century, when the great African states, particularly the Matapa state, was largely subjugated by the Portuguese. Gold mining intensified in that period, and the Matapa state sort of underwent a decline in its complexity throughout that period. We had sort of a reduction in stone walling, and a dispersal and a migration of the state away from its former heartlands into the drier Zambezi Valley area. Contemporaneous with that was the growth of a system called the Prazo system, or estates, which were carved out from the lands of these former African polities, particularly in the hatched area that you see here. And those Prazos were made up of two main groups. The first were free Africans who retained many of their sort of previous rights, but they paid tribute to the European ruler rather than the African chief as beforehand. And also slaves, in other words, unfree inhabitants who were attached to the Prazo, but they formed quite a wide range of activities, actually, including crafts, field hands, weaving, soldiers, traders, and so forth. The slave trade itself grew in the late 18th century in particular, and as I'll explore later, that played a particularly important role in the drought-related crisis and its effects that struck particularly hard in the 1820s. Environmentally, Mozambique is wettest in the Zambezi Delta area, which you can sort of see here, where rainfall is around 1,400, 1,500 millimeters per year. This declines to around 800, 900 millimeters at Mozambique Island here, and a few hundred kilometers up the Zambezi at Tet, this declines to around 600 millimeters. So the crisis itself and the multidimensional nature of that crisis, first and foremost, involved the desertion of many of the Zambezi Prazos in the 1820s, as well as virtually the abandonment of the settlement of Tet in the late 1820s, and the decline of many of the former trading fairs that were further upstream, like Zumbo, as well as those in the eastern highlands of Zimbabwe and the sort of central western part of Mozambique around this area. Accompanying that was the decline of the old Prazo system. So many of these smaller estates were concentrated into larger, what were termed super Prazos, which increasingly clustered in the hands of a few warlords, as many of the old Prazo holders left for Brazil. And accompanying the decline of those trading fairs was also actually the breakdown in the established system of trading in ivory and gold that had characterized, not in a static format, but had been present throughout much of the previous few centuries and even before that as well. The period was also accompanied by conflict, increased raiding and migration. That was both local in nature, involving some of the African polities like Barway and its neighboring Prazos, as well as the Matapa state in its form and its different form at that time, and a larger scale element of conflict from the African polities that migrated from south of the Limpopo, which has been linked to what is termed by some as the Afrikaan. In terms of droughts, the particular episode, as I mentioned, that has been studied in depth by Newitt and others was termed the Great Mozambique Drought, which struck in the late 1820s, and that was associated with large-scale famine mortality. And Newitt is actually quite firm in his assessment of the consequences of that drought, which he firmly attributes to many of the other symptoms of the crisis that we saw in the late 1820s. And I guess if you look at the sort of richness of the qualitative evidence that we have, it's quite easy to see why, because we have very widespread accounts from different parts of Mozambique of the sort of generic nature of this drought and its resultant famine. And you also have quite a sort of explanatory dimension to those accounts, in that you see explanations and descriptions of subsistence crises which were due to the drought, which was general. You see the state of the town of Senna explained because of the Great Famine that was there for 3 or 4 years up to 1829 and continued beyond then. And there was the explanation that even if sufficient rain fell, there were no hands to do the cultivating because the slaves were scattered in various lands, not in the district of this town. And also at Sefala, which was a much smaller settlement by this town, you had again the explanatory famine used as the explanatory variable in the state of that settlement. But despite that rather convincing evidence, I think there's some unresolved questions, certainly insofar as the nature of drought and its chronology is concerned, and it's also its significance relative to perhaps earlier events. So a few of these questions are: what was the characteristics of this drought in independent reconstructions, so those not derived from the same sources that are used to analyze its effects? And really, how exceptional was this drought compared with earlier events? Secondly, there are other questions that flow from that, which are why was the drought apparently so transformative in the social and economic history of the region here in the late 1820s, but less so in other instances? And thirdly, there's a question of why did that drought have different effects between societies? I'm not going to so much explore that in this presentation, but I might touch on it at the end. So just to examine that first unresolved question before moving on to the others, there have been attempts in many different parts of Africa to look at this sort of longer term, long run climate variability, going right back to the sort of mid-16th century by Sharon Nicholson in particular, also Joseph Miller for Angola. But there's been not really a systematic or / comprehensive attempt to do the same thing for Mozambique. So before we actually look at a new attempt to do that, here are some independent reconstructions of the rainfall variability in that period. The first from ships' logbooks for Southeast South Africa, then some rainfall series from documentary records for various parts of Southeastern and South Central Africa. Fifthly, a reconstruction from Nicholson for KwaZulu-Natal, which is a neighboring region of Mozambique. And finally, for a tree ring-based reconstruction of northeastern Zimbabwe. And when analysed together, those accounts show that not just the 1820s, but actually the last years of the 18th century were also relatively dry. So in fact, in Series A from ships' logbooks, we see this rain year of 1796-97, the second driest in the series, and also in the Zimbabwe reconstruction, 1798 was the driest in that whole series, which runs through to the 20th century. The 1810s were significantly wetter, but then in the 1820s, we had a reversion to dry conditions. And particularly in the logbook reconstruction, we can see this sort of period here was a protracted period of drought, 1826, the driest in that series, and support for that pattern in chronologies B, C, and E. Lesotho, the record for that period is a bit more patchy, so it's perhaps not surprising that we don't see such convincing evidence there. The northeastern Zimbabwe tree ring shows slightly different evidence of drought and its phase at that time, I suppose. So some work I've been doing recently has been putting this into a much longer term context by looking at a large body of evidence, both in English translations and in Portuguese, unpublished and published. And what we've come up with is a sort of wet and dry, very simple classification, arranged by confidence intervals, 1 being low confidence, 3 being high confidence. And we've classified 68 of quite a lot of rain years. There are limitations with this, with the evidence. Wet conditions are generally under-recorded compared to dry. And also normal sort of rainy seasons aren't really tended to be classified at all. But nevertheless, what that does give us is a sort of a long run view of when did those kind of multi-year dry periods occur. And actually there were quite a few that were multi-year, so back-to-back drought, for example, but only 4 of those were over 3 years in duration. 1 in the late 16th century, 1 in the 17th century, and then 2 sort of back-to-back events in the late 18th and early 19th century. And in the middle of those, there was also a 3-year drought at the turn of the century itself. And 3 of those were also associated with locust plague events. And some of that increased coverage in the 19th century may well be because of the increasing quantities of evidence. You can see that the 19th century was marked as probably the highest relative proportion of seasons classified as dry, but that's not a completely linear relationship or trend. We see the late 16th century also had quite a number of years classified as dry. Now, there's a lot of information displayed on this slide, but I suppose this figure is the sort of most relevant here. What you see is about 8, 9, or 10 paleoclimate proxy series from the southeastern part of the summer rainfall zone of Africa. And you can quite clearly see that in this yellow shaded area here, sort of 17th and 18th century, this is basically the imprint of the Little Ice Age on Southern Africa, or at least its main phase. Okay, so there's quite consistent evidence of dry conditions in that almost 2-century period. But actually we get, towards the period of interest, we get a kind of a transition where, you get far less consistency in the signals of those records. In fact, you get quite significant increases in variability between the records and also within those individual time series. Some of those, like the Lake Malawi record, were characterized by very strong signs of drought around the turn of the century and in the years following that. And others, like that from KwaZulu-Natal, the Carl Kloof record, and also the Cold Air Cave record from not too far away from Johannesburg, were marked by quite substantial drops from a relatively high point. So there is evidence to suggest that this was a period of climatic transition out of the main phase of the Little Ice Age and into a more variable window of climate towards the overall end of the Little Ice Age later in that century. So just to get into summing up how all of that affects the significance of this great Mozambique drought that Newitt has written at length about, we know that this was actually proximate, well, I wouldn't say hot on the heels of, but it was within a generation of severe and protracted droughts in the 1790s. And also I mentioned a drought at the turn of the century as well, which was about 3 years in duration. And the evidence for that 1790s drought is relatively patchy, comes mostly from the evidence of Lacerda, but he did note widespread mortality, particularly of livestock, also of people. But we didn't see the kind of breakdown of Prazo society, at least, that we saw in the 1820s. And we also know that this event came at the time that there was a climatic transition in most of those paleoclimate records. From other evidence, from a long history of scholarship, we know that this period also, of course, marked a increase in slave exports from Mozambique when it became one of, if not the largest supplier for the transatlantic slave trade, certainly by the 1820s. And we can see from some quantitative data, which is quite widely quoted and referenced, that the number of slave exports from Quelimane increased very rapidly in the early 19th century itself. Meanwhile, exports of grain, gold and ivory all declined across the same period. And just before that, the drought of the 1820s as well, the opening up of free trade by liberal administrations in 1821 flooded the markets in Mozambique with cheap food and also threatened the viability of Prazo food production. So we can start to see the interaction of these variables coming together in the run-up to and during the time span of that drought. So just to put that into a sort of concluding slide, there was a significant environmental component to this crisis, but it was not by any means the only component that marked those years. That was not just drought. There was a severe smallpox outbreak as well in the late 1820s. But those drought periods were relatively exceptional in the sort of three-century period of the coverage that we've looked at in terms of climate history of this period. Those back-to-back events did, of course, lead to repeated harvest failure, but it was not inevitable that had to lead to famine mortality, of course. At the same time, we have the growth of the slave trade, we have expanding activities of capital, and we have a change and a decline in the sort of traditional system of trade in Zambezia. And that was not helped, of course, by the effects of drought itself, like the blocking of river channels. Now, at the same time, we also have internal changes within the Prazo system. So there was a growth in absenteeism, certainly in this period, and an intensification of exploitation, as work by Isaacman and others have shown. And the sort of concurrent occurrence of the growth of the slave trade led a number of Prazo holders to enslave and sell off their free Africans. This has been linked, of course, to a breakdown of Prazo relations, an undermining of Portuguese authorities, and a desertion of slaves on the Prazos, and also migration of free Africans, perhaps north of the Zambezi. And at the same time, we also have those conflict elements, partly related to the slave trade. We have an increased sort of predatory militarism taking place in certainly as a response to drought as well in the Motapa state, for example. And we have responses recorded like raiding and banditry. And that sort of loops round to putting all those processes together, leading to a general failure of coping strategies as the drought wore on. It's really about sort of 3 years into that drought that we start to get strong bodies of evidence piling up about the severe impacts on society due to the concurrent nature of those processes, particularly the loss of agricultural labour, which actually then started, of course, to reinforce the effects of those harvest failures and so on. And it's really only by putting all those variables and processes together that we can account for that abandonment and breakdown of the old Proso system that I mentioned earlier. And that concludes the presentation. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hannaford. And for our final presentation of this panel, I'm pleased to introduce Yadhav Deerpaul, who is a PhD student of Iowa State University in the USA. And he will present a talk entitled Strands of a Longue Durée Study from the British government's reports of the Sanitary Commission from 1884 in Mauritius.
Hello everyone, I am Yadhav Deerpaul. First I have to say that there was a slight typo in the title. It's not from on my part. It's not from 1884, it was from 1882. My apologies for that. So in 1879, a commission was set up in British Mauritius to inquire into the operation of the public health laws of a colony and to suggest reforms which could be made. And what I'm particularly interested in this current research, which is at still a very preliminary stage, is to see how the issue of malaria was being studied and researched long before Ronald Ross developed his theories that it was transmitted through mosquitoes. So for example, the multiple, what I can call strands of longue durée studies within the works of this Sanitary Commission. We have a chronological assessment of the sanitary laws passed in Mauritius from 1851 to 1875. So they assess the effectiveness of each laws. And there's also the statistical analysis of admissions from fever into the civil hospital, which was one of the main hospitals from 1820 to 1863. And the main aim was to determine if malaria developed within the island or it was imported from abroad. But beyond that, there was the, what I can say, the interesting clash of ideas between Andrew Davidson, the physician, and Shaul Meldrum, who was a meteorologist. So both of them also prepared separate reports which were considered by the Sanitary Commission. And within the reports, for example, of Andrew Davidson, who was more leaning towards the idea that there was a miasmic development of disease in Mauritius, he also gave, for example, statistical analysis, and he kind of tried to find like flaws within these statistics, which were probably defective at that time, but which nevertheless showed that the island was always unhealthy. And during his analysis, he made, for example, correlations with the census of 1851 to demonstrate the margins of error. And another interesting form of analysis which Andrew Davidson made aware of was the fallacies of borders. Mauritius was divided into several political districts, and the statistics were published by these based on these different political districts. But he said that these different political districts and boundaries do not actually show how the local conditions of the specific places were. And the changes to the population distribution were not accounted. There was also disappearance of certain localities and creations of new ones. And based on these assessments, he made the conclusion that Mauritius was never a healthy country due to high death rate in comparison to other places with temperate climate. And he made an assumption that this was due to monastic influences. He also talked about the impact of deforestation and how it led to this outbreak of epidemic. And this is a map of actually the historical deforestation which was done. And the second one is a simulation based on actually a BA thesis by Matthijs Hinkamp. And next to Andrew Davidson's report, we had Charles Meldrum's report, who also acknowledged this historical deforestation which happened and which impacted on the malaria. But the main difference with Charles Meldrum was that he said that reforestation would not bring anything new. And the island cannot be in the same state as it was 40 years ago, that is 40 years before 1880. And Charles Meldrum's approach was even more of a longue durée style. For example, he looked at the local, global, and Indian Ocean population densities to make his arguments. He provided statistics of continental Europe for 1862, of several places in India, and then compared them with Mauritius and made the conclusion based on these that the population density in Mauritius were higher than in Europe and in any province of India except Ur. And he also looked at the interaction of weather and epidemic on a global scale. He compared the annual rainfalls at Bombay, Madras, Mauritius, Cape, Adelaide, Melbourne, and Sydney from 1854 to 1868. And he made the conclusion that this period was actually not unique to Mauritius, but these interactions and massive changes to the weather were also happening in other places of the Indian Ocean and also beyond it. And he provided for the places in bold disaggregated data, and for those in Europe, he provided aggregated data to make this longue durée comparison of weather and epidemic. And there was another interesting comparison by Charles Meldrum on the islands of Rodrigue, which is next to Mauritius here, and also Seychelles. So he said that, for example, Rodrigue had a comparatively small death rate due to smallness of population, but geographical position of the island in the southeast trade wind, and how it was, in his own words, in the heart of a great ocean. But there was a higher death rate in Seychelles, probably due to the denser population, the higher temperature, and the less frequent trade wind. Yes, and he also talked about these years of great mortality, which also happened not only in Mauritius, but in other places of the world. And these periods of great mortality, according to him, coincided with extremes of solar activity. For example, he provided a list, and the balls are placed by me to make a difference between the different years. So we have, for example, the common years 1834, 1833 in Mauritius and Ceylon. And it goes on to show how he was forming his analysis on the years of great mortality between all the countries. And in the 1880s, as I said, Mauritius was a British colony. But preceding that, before 1810, it was a French colony. And he also employed data from the French period in his Longue study. For example, he looked at the temperature and relative humidity recordings by Lisa Geoffrey from 1787 to 1804. To 1804. I bet this data by Lisa Geoffrey had important gaps. And he also gave these interesting observations on how there were fallacies in this data. For example, the thermometers and hygrometers were perhaps not as reliable at that time. For example, a whalebone hygrometer was used. And he also made another, what you could say, what a historian would do. He made a chronology of all the recorded droughts from 1726 during the French period to 1867 during the British period, mentioning all the sources he employed. So Meldrum, after doing all this long durée analysis and statistical analysis, said that the cause of the malaria fever in Mauritius was due to the germ theory, in contrast to Davidson's idea on the miasma theory. And he also laid a lot of emphasis on the annual periodicities in these mortalities, which coincided with other meteorological elements. So this is still, as I said, a preliminary research where I'm combining the narratives and the statistics. For example, this is the table used by Davidson, which I made reference earlier, and which he criticized. For example, for Rivière-du-Remport, you can see that in 1872, it was 17.3 death rate, but that does not mean that there was no unhealthy place in it. And as you mentioned, these statistics could conceal a lot of other facts. And this is another time series which I made using GIS, and which is based on the data by Davidson, which was then criticized by Meldrum for being too limited. But basically in this data, Davidson was trying to show how Mauritius was always an unhealthy place by comparing it to other places in the world. But Meldrum later said that this was not always the case, and there were, for example, meteorological events that impacted this. So to conclude, there were divergences between Davidson and Meldrum on the miasma and germ theories in 1882, before the work of Ronald Ross in 1907. But nevertheless, some of their ideas and statistics could be relevant, and there could be a form of colonial knowledge on the interpretation of this data. And that's basically what I had to share. Thank you.